Hello friends, I hope you all are doing great. Today I am going to share with you the second part of this story. I hope you have listened to part 1 as well. If you haven't, click on the I button now to listen to part 1, or you can find it on this channel's page. This will help you understand the story better. In the first part, I told you about the strange and mysterious events happening at the Hinterkaifeck farmhouse over the past 6 months, and how on the evening of April 4th, 1922, the bodies of all 6 residents of the farmhouse were found. This story continues from there. So, 2 days after the bodies were found on April 4th, 1922, the autopsies of all 6 bodies began on April 6th, 1922. The autopsy revealed that all the victims had been struck on the head with a sharp and heavy object, possibly a mattock. Additionally, Cecilia and Victoria had been strangled. There were no signs of binding or restraint on any of the bodies, meaning that none of the 6 victims were tied up or tried to defend themselves, which was very surprising because people usually try to defend themselves before being killed. The autopsy also revealed that the 7-year-old girl, Cecilia, had survived for several hours after the initial attack, dying last from head injuries and shock, and she was found clutching her own hair, which she had torn out in distress. However, the most shocking finding from the autopsy was that all 6 people had been killed on the night of Friday, March 31st, 1922. This confused the police because it meant they had been dead for several days, even though there had been activity inside the house during that time. Detective Ryan Gruber, who was leading the investigation, delved deeper. When he questioned the relatives and neighbors, things started to become clearer. It was discovered that the new maid's sister, Patience Rieger, was the last person to see Andreas Gruber's family and her sister Maria alive when she dropped her off at the Hinterkaifeck farmhouse on the evening of March 31st, 1922, around 6 p.m. Additionally, the newspapers from March 31st onwards had not been picked up, and no one had seen anyone from the farmhouse after that date. Considering the autopsy report and these details, it became clear that the entire family had been murdered on the night of March 31st, 1922. But the question remained, if the family was killed on March 31st, what had been happening inside the farmhouse over the past few days? All the evidence pointed to one conclusion. Whoever entered the house on that snowy night 6 months earlier never left. This person killed the 6 family members, took care of the animals, drew milk from the cows, and cooked food for themselves for the next 4 days. Villagers had seen smoke coming from the kitchen chimney several times over those 4 days. After the autopsy report and a thorough investigation of the farmhouse, the German police reached another conclusion. The bodies of Andreas, his wife, and Victoria's daughter Cecilia had been moved to the barn not after being killed, but before they were killed. The killer somehow managed to lure these 4 individuals into the barn one by one, and then killed them all. Victoria and her daughter Cecilia were wearing their daytime clothes, which indicated that they were murdered earlier in the evening of March 31st. Later that night, Andreas and his wife Cecilia, who were in their night clothes, were killed. After attacking the 7-year-old Cecilia, the killer might have assumed she was dead and left her, which is why she survived for several hours before finally succumbing to her injuries later. After killing these 4 people, the murderer went to Victoria's room and killed her 2.5-year-old son, who was sleeping in his cradle. The killer then murdered the new maid, who had started working that day. After the autopsies were completed on April 8, 1922, the bodies of the 6 victims were packed in coffins. Their heads were kept for further investigation and were returned after the investigation was completed. On April 8, 1922, the bodies were taken to a location about 4 kilometers away from their farmhouse for burial. This case became so famous at the time that over 3,000 people attended their funeral, a remarkable number given that it was a time without the internet or extensive transportation facilities. Meanwhile, the police were deeply engrossed in solving this mystery. The first thing that came to their mind was that the murders might have been committed with the intention of robbery, as the family was quite wealthy. However, after thoroughly searching the house, they found a substantial amount of German marks and coins left untouched. Thus, the police dismissed the robbery angle, since it was clear the killer did not hurriedly leave without taking anything. The killer stayed in the house for the next 4 days, with ample time to find the money and valuables, yet chose not to take anything. After this, the police tried to find the murder weapon inside the farmhouse, which was a mattock used for the attacks. However, despite thoroughly searching the entire farmhouse, they couldn't find any weapon. The police even used search dogs to help locate the weapon, but to no avail. They speculated that perhaps the killer took the weapon with him when he left. During this time, a farmer named Samaj Reblender approached the police and reported that on the night of March 31st to April 1st around 3:00 a.m., he was heading home. As he passed by the Hinterkaifeck farm, he saw 2 men standing by a tree near the farmhouse talking to each other. When the men noticed the farmer approaching, they fell silent, turned away, and hid their faces. At that moment, the farmer didn't think much of it. However, upon learning about the murders at Hinterkaifeck, he realized those 2 men might have been the murderers. For the detectives, this information was significant, but since the farmer couldn't see the faces of the men due to the darkness, it wasn't very useful. The police questioned all the neighbors and anyone who had visited the farmhouse between March 31st and April 4th, including the newspaper delivery person. The delivery person mentioned that the farmhouse was haunted, but the police dismissed this claim as they didn't consider ghosts or spirits in their investigation. However, based on another part of his statement, the police arrested 2 brothers, Karl and Anton Bischler. It was revealed that Anton used to work at the Hinterkaifeck farm and sometimes did odd jobs for Andreas Gruber in his fields. When they had no work, the brothers would commit petty thefts, and they had stolen chickens from Andreas Gruber on several occasions. One day, Anton suddenly proposed marriage to the maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had lost her previous husband. Despite his advances, the maid declined, as she was warned to stay away from him. Enraged by the rejection, Anton threatened to kill her and her entire family. The police interrogated the 2 brothers thoroughly, but they didn't provide any useful information, and no solid evidence was found against them. Consequently, the police were forced to release them. After this, the police followed a lead from a statement given by a man named Joseph Betts. They arrested a man based on this information. Joseph and the suspect used to work together around 1920. One day, Peter shared a plan with Joseph to rob a farmhouse and mentioned the Hinterkaifeck farm. He said an old farmer lived there with his wife and daughter, and there were no other houses nearby. They only needed to kill the old farmer and take the money. However, Joseph refused and stopped speaking to Peter about it. This lead also didn't yield any results. Nearly 5 more years passed, and the police were still empty-handed. Then a strange incident occurred. Almost 5 years after the murders, in 1927, one night around midnight, a man knocked on a house door in a village. When the homeowner opened the door, he saw a stranger standing there. Before the homeowner could ask anything, the stranger asked if the killer of Andreas Gruber and his family had been found. The homeowner replied, "No." The stranger then shouted, "I killed them all!" and quickly ran into the nearby forest. Before the villagers could comprehend what had happened, the man disappeared into the woods. For several more years, the German police continued to investigate this case, making every effort to solve it. They questioned everyone who had any connection with the Gruber family, whether neighbors, relatives, friends, shopkeepers, bus drivers, conductors, school staff, or anyone who had ever had any contact with the family. They left no stone unturned, interviewing anyone who might have crossed paths with the Grubers. They even questioned people who had simply passed by the farmhouse between March 31st and April 4th. Despite all this, they found no leads. During their investigation, the police arrested over 100 suspects and interrogated them, but to no avail. They even announced a reward for any information about the killer, eventually increasing it to 500,000 marks. But still, they got nothing. After 33 years, in 1955, the police did not officially close the case, but they stopped actively investigating it. Although different investigation departments revisited the case over the years, no progress was made. Later, some theories emerged about who the killer might be. The first theory suggested that the entire family was murdered by Victoria Gabriel's supposedly deceased husband, Carl Gabriel. This theory arose because Carl's body was never found after his reported death. Even if we accept that Carl Gabriel was the murderer, the question remains: why would he kill his own wife, child, and entire family? The reason behind this was a dark secret known to the entire village but never openly discussed. This secret was the illicit relationship between Andreas Gruber and his daughter Victoria Gabriel. Besides Andreas's anger issues, this was a key reason the entire village disliked him. As I mentioned in the first part of the story, I would reveal the reason later. Andreas had been having a physical relationship with his daughter Victoria since she was 15 or 16 years old. Victoria once confided in Lorenz Schlittenbauer's wife that her father was forcing himself on her, and at that time, Victoria was only 16 years old. This relationship continued for years, but when Victoria married Carl Gabriel in April 1914, and he started living at the Hinterkaifeck farm with them, it seemed things might improve. However, they did not. One day, there was a terrible fight between Andreas and Carl, likely because Andreas continued his illicit relationship with Victoria even after her marriage. Carl might have caught Andreas and Victoria together, which would have been a traumatic shock for any husband. As a result, Carl left Victoria and returned to his parents. For any husband, witnessing such a scene would be nothing short of traumatic, so Carl left Victoria and returned to his parents. A few days later, World War I began, and in August 1914, Carl was called to serve. A few months after that, in December 1914, he died in a bombing, leaving Victoria a widow. However, Carl Gabriel's body was never recovered. Meanwhile, exactly 9 months after the wedding, in January 1915, Victoria gave birth to her first child. It is said that Victoria was already pregnant when she got married, and that Cecilia was actually Andreas' daughter. Even after Cecilia's birth, Andreas continued his illicit relationship with his daughter. These are not just rumors, but there is also legal evidence to support this. In 1915, the local authorities discovered the illicit relationship between Andreas and his daughter Victoria. As a result, the police arrested both of them. The case went to court, and both were found guilty. On May 28, 1915, the district court sentenced Andreas to 1 year and Victoria to 1 month in prison. After serving his sentence, Andreas returned a year later, but he did not reform and continued his illicit relationship with his daughter. In September 1919, Victoria gave birth to another child, Josef, who was believed to be the result of her relationship with Andreas. Some believed that Carl Gabriel, Victoria's missing husband, who was presumed dead, was alive and returned to avenge his wife's infidelity by killing the entire family. This theory emerged because Carl Gabriel's body was never found. However, this was debunked as the German police eventually discovered that Karl Gabriel had indeed died in France on December 12, 1914, during World War I, and his body had been buried there. Another theory was that the entire family was killed by their neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He was a strong suspect, as he had a motive. During World War I, after Karl Gabriel's death, Victoria grew close to Lorenz. Although Lorenz was initially married, his wife died of an illness in 1918, and he and Victoria became intimate, leading to her pregnancy. Victoria did not inform Lorenz about the pregnancy, and they eventually decided to marry. Lorenz approached Andreas Grober to ask for Victoria's hand in marriage, but Andreas refused, not wanting his daughter to remarry. Andreas imposed strict restrictions on Victoria, only allowing her to go to church on Sundays and limiting her social interactions. When Lorenz informed Victoria of her father's refusal, she agreed that they could not marry. However, she demanded compensation for the upkeep of the child she was carrying, believed to be Lorenz's. Upon hearing about Victoria's pregnancy, Lorenz was shocked and refused to give any support. He said, "It's not necessarily my child. It could also be your father's child, because you have physical relationships with him as well." But Victoria insisted, "No. This child is yours, and you must provide for its upbringing." Victoria and her entire family began to pressure Lorenz, and his name started to be maligned throughout the village. But Lorenz did not yield to their pressure, and once again informed the authorities about the illicit relationship between Andreas and his daughter Victoria. Consequently, on September 30th, 1919, the authorities arrested them once more. Meanwhile, on September 7th, although it was never clearly determined whether Joseph's father was Andreas or Lorenz, some villagers said that in 1922, Victoria planned to file a legal case against Lorenz for being Joseph's father and for child support. Lorenz might have found out about this, and since he was not financially capable of providing the support at that time, he killed the entire family to avoid the burden and the case. Additionally, as you know, Lorenz was one of the first to discover the family's bodies. According to two neighbors who were with him, he did not react the way a normal person would upon seeing dead bodies, and there wasn't even a trace of shock on his face. When the two neighbors first saw the bodies, they had warned Lorenz not to touch anything, but Lorenz flipped over all the bodies and ruined the entire crime scene. After this, he daringly went alone to the main door of the farmhouse from the inside, and then unlocked the gate from inside to let his two neighbors in. Now the question arises, how did Lorenz manage to open the main door of the farmhouse? You might remember that the key to the farmhouse's main door was missing and never found later. It is very likely that Lorenz himself stole that key. However, when the police asked him about the key, he claimed that he found it inside the house when he went in. When the police questioned why he went inside alone, considering the killer might still be in the farmhouse, he said he was worried about the safety of his 2.5-year-old son Joseph after seeing the slaughter, and went inside to check on him. But this answer backfired because this was the same Joseph he had previously refused to acknowledge as his son and had filed a police complaint against. Moreover, according to the theory, his house was one of the few closest to the Hinterkaifeck farmhouse, making it plausible for him to frequently visit the farmhouse unnoticed. The German police repeatedly questioned him, but Lorenz said how he could stay at the farmhouse from March 31st to April 4th without the villagers noticing, and how he could go there day or night without anyone realizing. Well, his point was valid because it was a small village, and in such villages, everyone knows who lives where, what they do, how many children they have, and where they are going or coming from. Besides, the police did not find any scientific evidence against Lorenz. so they released him. Later, in 2007, some students from the Munich Police Academy tried to solve this case using new technology. They believed that it was very difficult to prove that a single person was the killer because many pieces of evidence had deteriorated over time, and the crime scene was so contaminated that scientific evidence could not be collected properly. After reading the entire case file and examining the remaining evidence, all the students reached the same conclusion. They said that the person who murdered the Gruber family did it with a personal motive. They knew who the killer was, but there was no point in revealing the name since the killer had already died. Revealing the name would only bring trouble to the killer's surviving family. Thus, this report did not explicitly state who the killer was, but it pointed towards Loren's return power. Among all the suspects, he was the one with a personal motive to kill the entire family. Lorenz also died in 1941, but his children are still alive. Besides this, there were many other theories with different names. For example, the Gum brothers, whose sister said on her deathbed that her brothers had killed the Gruber family. Then there were Carl S. and his brother Andreas S., whose mother once told her friend that the two brothers had killed the Gruber family. There were other names too, but the police did not find concrete evidence against any of them. The way the Gruber family was murdered and how the killer stayed there for 4 days afterward led to another theory, that the crime could not have been committed by a normal person, but rather by a deranged individual or a serial killer. Many people still believe that whatever happened in the farmhouse was not the act of a human, but of some supernatural power, which had been present in the house for the past 6 months. Because it was an invisible force, it was never seen, even after searching the farmhouse multiple times, although there was no place to hide in the farmhouse. Moreover, according to the police, the dead bodies found in the barn were brought there one by one before being killed. There was no evidence that any of them were tied up or forcibly dragged there, nor did any of them resist. This indicates that something had overpowered them, and they went to the barn one by one without any struggle and waited for the attack. I don't think any conscious person would willingly go to a killer and wait for the attack. Even if we assume that the killer brought them to the barn at gunpoint and killed them one by one, none of them tried to save themselves, although a dying person makes every effort to save themselves. The 7-year-old girl who survived the attack was so terrified that she even lost her hair in fear after regaining consciousness. The maid who arrived there to work that day was found with all her clothes, sweater, shoes, etc. still on. She hadn't even opened her bag, which she had brought with her belongings, meaning either the killer murdered her as soon as she entered the house, or the maid saw something in the house that made her plan to leave immediately. She had packed her belongings and was ready to leave when she was killed. This raises the question, what did she see in the house that made her change her mind? Additionally, if this was the work of a human, no person would be foolish enough to stay in the house for 4 more days after killing 6 people, as every killer fears getting caught. Only someone who has no connection to the human world and is unaffected by human laws or rules could do such a thing. The heads, which were severed post-mortem and sent to Nuremberg for research, were later shown to a fortune teller and a witch who practiced black magic. After examining the 6 heads and reading their minds, the witch said that the person who committed these murders had a very distorted face, extremely sharp features, and a very cruel laugh. The heads were supposed to be returned to their coffins immediately after the investigation, but to this day, they have not been returned, and all 6 bodies are buried without their heads. Later, when the authorities were questioned about the missing heads, they said that during the Second World War, when Nuremberg was bombed, all the heads were scattered and never found again. However, considering the Second World War started almost 17 years after the murders, in 1912, and their plan was to return the heads to the coffins immediately after the investigation. The question arises, what were they doing with the heads for the next 17 years? The truth is that all those heads mysteriously disappeared just a few days after the investigation. And later, the authorities used the Second World War bombing as an excuse to cover it up. After this murder, people were so scared that they even stopped passing near the farmhouse, knowing from the old maid stories that there was something haunted inside. When these 6 murders happened together, it spread even more fear among the people. Not only at night, but people avoided passing by the farmhouse even during the day. Since there were no heirs to the farmhouse, it was later handed over to Victoria Gabriel's father in April, as Gabriel had also died. However, even they did not want to live in the haunted house, so about a year after the murder, in February 1923, the entire farmhouse was demolished, and the whole village gathered to witness it. But when the farmhouse was being torn down, a murder weapon was mysteriously found inside, which shocked everyone. They found a spade and a small knife inside the farmhouse, both with dried blood on them. Later, when the police examined the weapons, they found no fingerprints. The question was why the police did not find these weapons earlier when they thoroughly searched the house, even using search dogs, but failed to find these weapons that were present in the house. Was this just a coincidence or something supernatural? No one knows. After the house was demolished, a memorial was built at the site, which can still be seen today. More than 100 years have passed since this murder, yet it remains one of the biggest mysteries in German history. Many questions are still unanswered. Who came to the house that night? Who killed these 6 people, and why? No one knows. This secret remains a secret. It is said that whatever non-human entity was in the house was still there when the villagers arrived to see the 6 bodies. If it was a human, he quietly slipped out with the crowd, and if it was a spirit or ghost, no one saw it, just as no one saw anything for the 6 months leading up to the murders. Whether the entity showed itself to the victims at the time of their murder is a question that remains unanswered. Even after 100 years, the file of this case has not been closed. People involved in crime still read this case file and try to solve it. Therefore, the last page of this case is yet to be written. So, what do you think? Who was the killer? Be sure to write your opinion in the comment box. That's all for today's story. I hope you liked the information I provided. Thanks for watching the video. If you like this video, subscribe now. You can also comment your thoughts about this story. Bye!